Good morning, everyone. Good early morning to you, and welcome to today's webinar, Dementia, Risk for Financial Abuse. And these complimentary webinars are brought to you through a collaboration with O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choices, Hospice and Palliative Services, and Alzheimer's Orange County. And my name is Kim Bailey from Alzheimer's Orange County, and I'll be your host today. I think it's time to introduce our speaker. We are delighted to have Carol Tryon. She is the Director of Family Services here at Alzheimer's Orange County. And Carol received her Bachelor's of Psychology with a minor in Women's Study from Cal State Fullerton and her master's degree in social work from Cal State Long Beach, along with an emphasis in older adults. In 2000, Ms. Tryon was hired by Human Options to research and develop a program to meet the needs of older, battered women and victims of elder abuse. Ms. Tryon developed the Safe Options for Seniors, a one-of-a-kind program that helps seniors break the cycle of violence in their families. Carol has served as the chairperson of the Orange County Family Violence Council Elder Abuse Committee from 2001 through 2004, on the Planning Committee for the International Family Violence Conferences from 2002 through 2009. She has helped to develop a training curriculum that's been presented to local probation officers and law enforcement officers. She has presented trainings on the issue of elder abuse across the United States. In addition, she regularly presented elder abuse training for law enforcement, local domestic violence shelters, senior social service agencies, and all around the senior community. Carol is one of the founding members of the nation's first Elder Abuse Forensic Center located in Orange County. Besides being the founding coordinator of Safe Options for Seniors, Ms. Tryon has served as the clinical director of Mariposa Women and Family Center, a military and family life counselor at Camp Pendleton, California, and as I said, she is currently and thankfully the Director of Family Services at Alzheimer's Orange County. So we're in for a very informative and informed lecture by Carol. And Carol, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, everyone. So we'll go over the course objectives. Today we are going to define elder abuse and the types of abuse, identify indicators of harm and abuse, define what makes older adults vulnerable to financial abuse, identify what occurrence actually constitutes financial abuse, and then look at some financial exploitation warning signs. So first, in order to understand elder abuse, we should understand what the law says. In California, the law is Penal Code 368, and it includes dependent adults. So the elder is anyone 65 and above, a dependent adult is anyone 18 through 64. And the abuse is the infliction of physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, or financial harm on an elder. And this has to result in physical harm, pain, or mental suffering. So unlike children, when we report child abuse, we do consider mental suffering when we can report elder abuse. For the national incidents, we know that for every one report of elder abuse, at least 14 go unreported. In the case of financial abuse, it's only 1 out of 44 cases that are ever reported. And we now know that in some recent studies that 1 out of 9 seniors report being harmed or exploited. So if we had to break that down, we would say that about every 5 seconds an elderly person is abused. And California has 10% of all the elder abuse cases in the United States, with 1/3 of them being just in 5 states. If you look at them, you can see why many of the states are chosen: California, Florida, Texas. Obviously, people go there for the weather in Florida and Texas because there's no taxes. New York and Pennsylvania have some great senior services, and yet our family started on the East Coast and migrated west. So very often we see this is why there's such a large number of seniors in these states also. We also know that most elders are abused in more than one form of elder abuse. People just aren't abused physically or emotionally or financially. In order to accomplish their goal, the person abusing them usually has to use more than one type of abuse. And self-neglect is considered abuse by seniors who have loss of cognitive impairment. So the higher the level of cognitive impairment, the more likely they are to self-neglect, which means someone who has all their life never gone to the doctor can be cognitively impaired and as a senior still choose to not go to the doctor, and that is not self-neglect. But someone who doesn't understand the ramifications of what their abuse means or their self-neglect means by not going to the doctor or not eating, not paying their bills, could be considered self-neglect, and that is reportable in the state of California. As you see, in California, we had approximately 225,000 cases of elder abuse, every year. In Orange County specifically, from in 2013, we had 8,374 cases, and in 2017, that number jumped to 13,640 cases. And from 2010 to 2017, 1/3 of all reported cases were financial abuse. The U.S. study says that 20% of caregivers express that they will become violent with the people they're providing care for. And these studies are repeated internationally and found out similar, if not higher, percentages of caregivers that are worried about abusing or have abused someone that they are caring for with dementia. A study in 2009 showed that 50% of the people with dementia experience some kind of abuse. And again, that's anything from neglect by the caregiver to physical, emotional, or psychological or financial abuse. Another study repeated in 2010 showed that caregiver abuse was detected at a rate of 47.3% when they surveyed the caregivers. And some people ask, how did we get that survey? The survey was done at UCI, where we actually interviewed caregivers, but we didn't say, did you abuse somebody? We asked them what their fears were, and asked them very specific questions on how they treated the people that they were caring for. And while a lot of people didn't consider what they did, either abuse nor neglect, they did fall in the reportable realms for the categories that we surveyed. So what does make an older adult vulnerable to abuse? Two of the most important factors is social isolation and mental impairment, such as dementia or Alzheimer's. And we, again, know that half of those people with dementia experience abuse and neglect. The other thing we see is a large increase of interpersonal violence at a higher rate of people with disabilities. For some reason, we tend to dehumanize people with disabilities, which includes those with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Other things that make people more vulnerable, besides physical disability or an illness, is suffering from anxiety or depression. Some personality needs, if someone has a mental status where they tend to need more help, or they have a personality disorder, it makes them a little more vulnerable to abuse. Grief, loneliness certainly increase people's risk of being abused because it's an easy thing to be taken advantage of. Often people feel, if they feel like they're going to be abandoned, which is very often one of the ways abusers take advantage of people by threatening to not visit them or allow their grandchildren to visit them or put them in a nursing home, make people more vulnerable to abuse. And then the fear of losing their independence. So many seniors, this is a very important factor. As long as they feel they are independent, they're less likely to be abused because they feel they have a way out. But once they start fear of losing their dependence, they're more vulnerable to people taking advantage of them. So the effects on elder abuse that we have studied show that elders who have been abused are 300% higher a risk of death compared to those who have not been mistreated. That means that someone who has been abused is more likely to die an early death than those who have not been abused. Also, we look at financial elder abuse in America. In one of our studies in 2010 showed that $2.9 billion were lost to seniors. Yet this crime is self-reported at higher rates than emotional, physical, or sexual abuse or neglect. And we also know that these things run hand in hand together. So very often when we see financial abuse, we know that there's other rates of abuse going on, but the abused person is very hesitant to report any of those others, or may not even recognize that it is abuse. In Orange County alone, from August of 2017 through November of 2017, it has been suggested by Adult Protective Services that seniors lost over $30 million. So something that's very important is that people know who's a mandated reporter. It's often very confused, and the state's Welfare and Institution Code spells it out very plainly, that is someone who has custody or provides care for an elder or dependent adult, and that doesn't matter if the person is being paid or not being paid. It also doesn't matter if it's a line staff or an administrator or a supervisor. All of these people are considered mandated reporters in the case of elder abuse, and they are expected to report to Adult Protective Services or law enforcement. However, even though it says and or, Adult Protective Services would be the first person that you refer to, unless there is an immediate emergent need to get law enforcement out there. And the people that have to report, the victim, either the victim has told them that this has occurred or has knowledge of the abuse, and the mandated reporter may have witnessed the abuse. And if there's any, again, incidents or conditions that reasonably lead the mandated reporter to suspect abuse. It is not the mandated reporter's job to investigate, just to have reasonable suspicion that the abuse has occurred. And reasonable suspicion means that the mandated reporter, if consulting with another person with like education and like experience, both come up with the idea that this is reportable, then the incident should be reported. What I tell my staff, though, is there's no reason not to consult with Adult Protective Services. We run hypothetical cases by them all the time when we're in that gray area of we're not sure if this is abuse. So we would refer to the experts to help us make those decisions if we're not 100% sure. And then who are mandated reporters? Well, anybody that's a care custodian, so anybody who's paid or unpaid taking care of someone. Anybody in the health practice field, the doctors, nurses, aides are. In 2005, bank employees were added to that list because of the financial abuse that we were seeing. So bank employees are trained to recognize financial abuse. Obviously, people that work in law enforcement, fire departments, for the county and the welfare departments. Added to that were the animal control people and the building code, because we do see a lot of people who are hoarding because they don't have capacity to understand that their behaviors could constitute self-neglect. Clergy members are mandated reporters. And any person, again, who has care or custody and responsible for an elder or dependent adult is a mandated reporter. And this is important because there are times when you have to report. And so sometimes the question is who has to report? So all of those people are required to report, and you must report as soon as possible to either the local ombudsman, Adult Protective Services, law enforcement, by phone as soon as it's practically possible, and a written report is followed up, which you can find online at Orange County Adult Protective Services, and that report is to be sent within 2 working days. A lot of people aren't sure, again, if their job is in those categories, so I always recommend, again, to consult with Adult Protective Services in the county. While the state laws are very specific, counties do have their own reporting requirements and decide what kind of cases they take on a local level. On a national level, there is no national law on elder abuse, what is defined as elder abuse, so reporting varies from state to state. California is a mandated state, whereas a state like Colorado, there is no mandate to report elder abuse. So if you're not in Orange County, I recommend that you check both with your local county representative and your state Office on Aging to find out what the criteria is within your state or county. If you don't report, this is a crime, and there are strong penalties for people who don't report. So if you do not report in the state of California and it's a misdemeanor, you could be fined with 6 months in a county jail or $1,000 or both. And a mandated reporter who fails to report physical abuse or any other type of abuse and great bodily harm or death has resulted from that, the punishment is 1 year in county jail, a fine of no more than $5,000, or both, fine and imprisonment. So these are very similar to what you see for child abuse. The state of California is very serious about reporting elder abuse. So I, again, recommend that if you're not sure, go to the source, call Adult Protective Services in your county, and ask them if they consider this a reportable offense. This way you have met your mandate, and you will protect an elder or a dependent adult at the same time. So let's look at what types of abuses there are. So we have in this broken down the types of abuse into several categories. First is verbal. And as you can see from the pie chart, verbal, psychological, verbal and emotional all fall under the psychological abuse. And this is because the point of verbal and emotional abuse is to break down somebody's self-esteem and make them feel worthless, make them feel like they have no choices, to make them more vulnerable to people taking advantage of them. Physical abuse, as you can see, is a smaller percent, as is sexual abuse. Neglect and self-neglect are lumped together in this category. Is still smaller abuse. What we see the largest abuses are is financial and psychological. And again, nothing works in a vacuum, so many times you'll see all of these together. To get someone to give you their money, you have to convince them that they're doing it of their own free will, or you're going to threaten them with some type of harm, whether it's physical or abandonment or isolation by taking their family members away or their friends away, is how people get taking advantage of people to get their money from them. So looking at the warning signs for the different types of abuse, for physical abuse, we notice whether or not there's grip marks around the arms and the legs, rope marks. Very often people think that they can restrain people. We've seen this where people will restrain someone to a bed or to a wheelchair thinking that they're going to not prevent harm from somebody falling or walking away. The reality is you cannot legally restrain anyone. Even in a facility, they have to have a doctor's order, and it's very specific as to how long and when they can do that. So restraints are considered part of physical abuse, as are chemical restraints, like using medication is also considered physical abuse. We also look, just like we do in children, for repeated unexplained injuries. And we also want to see how the person behaves. Do they refuse to go to the same emergency room for the same type of injuries? Do they refuse to get medical care? Or does the family refuse to get medical care? That all can be considered physical abuse along with neglect. Physical abuse can include hitting, beating, pushing, shoving, kicking, pinching, biting, burning, and the inappropriate use of medications, as I said, as for physical restraints and chemical restraints. While this is only a small prevalence of seeing people who use restraints, we do need to know that this is against the law. Verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse. Some of the signs that we see that this is happening is that the person is often uncommunicative and unresponsive. They appear frightful and suspicious, and they're not usually involved in their social contacts anymore. So people tend to withdraw, especially a lot of withdrawal is seen when people are verbally, emotionally, and psychologically abused. Verbal abuse and emotional abuse can include yelling and swearing, making insults, being disrespectful. Psychological abuse is more about a coercive and threatening type of behavior that sets up a power differential between the older adult, his and her family members, or the caregiver. It's also treating an older adult like a child or isolating them from family or friends, and like I said, keeping them from going to activities through force, threats, or manipulative behavior. This is a higher incident. About 63% of people experience some type of emotional or psychological abuse. Sexual abuse, these are some symptoms and signs that we would look for, but we need to remember that sexual abuse also can include inappropriate touching, photographing a person in suggestive poses, forcing a person to look at pornography. Early on in my career, I had a case where a son had his mom, who was wheelchair bound, forced her to watch pornography 8 to 10 hours a day. And this is considered sexual abuse because she wasn't wanting to do it and she had no way to leave. Obviously, forcing sexual contact with a third party or unwanted sexual behavior. And these include rape, sodomy, coerced nudity. And this is probably one of the most egregious but least reported forms of elder abuse. We recognize that only about 1% prevalence of this is, ever reported. Financial abuse, these are some of the symptoms you might see: irregular patterns of spending and withdrawals, buying items they don't need, with not paying their bills, having their utilities turned off. And one of the biggest threats for when we're working with people who have cognitive impairment or are very lonely and isolated is the presence of a new best friend or a new sweetheart. Very often, these are known as sweetheart scams, where somebody ingratiates themselves into the situation to take advantage financially of people. And this is, again, the highest reported abuse that there is. People have no trouble reporting financial abuse, especially family members. They report it more than anyone else. And the highest amount of family member reports are often about other family members who are taking their parents' money, or their fear that they're going to lose their portion of their inheritance. The other things we look at, though, are also financial scams by internet, phone, face-to-face scams, salespeople coming to the doors, etc. And we'll talk a little more about those. And the last one we look at is caregiver neglect. Some of the signs that you might see there is that people aren't getting enough food or water, not adequately dressed for the environment that they're in, are not bathed, are left unsupervised if they have dementia. They don't have the medical necessities that they need, like eyeglasses, walker, teeth, hearing aids, even though they can afford those items. If the caregiver is responsible for paying the bills, they often don't pay that, and they use the money irresponsibly. Family caregivers can inadvertently, unintentionally neglect an older relative simply because they don't have enough knowledge or resources or maturity to handle it. So caregiver neglect can fall in two categories, either intentional or unintentional. And again, unintentional is still illegal, and these are services, we want to get people services to help them. They are often doing the best they can in the situations they are. So we don't want them arrested, or we don't want anything to happen there, but getting APS involved is a good way to get them the services that they need, or get them educated more on how to handle the people that they are caring for. New studies now show that dementia is not, first signs of dementia is not necessarily memory loss, but it's the inability to manage their finances, which again makes people very vulnerable to someone taking advantage of them financially. We find that they're having trouble remembering how to write checks, or if they paid their bills, or how much money they actually have. So in the very early stages of dementia, elders are more vulnerable to financial abuse, found in this new study, looking at when financial abuse often starts and is often undetected. Okay, so let's look at the patterns of elder abuse that we see in the community. And the first one we were talking about was domestic violence. Spousal abuse that grows old. These are long-term relationships where there's been domestic violence present, but probably nothing was ever done. The perpetrator is still abusing, and the victim is still being abused. We know that this continues. However, the change is up until age 65, domestic violence is not reportable except by physicians. After age 65, because of the risk of dementia and disabilities, this is now reported as a form of elder abuse. So if domestic violence, as we call it, spousal abuse, grows old, has been continuing through a marriage and continues past age 65, it is reported as a form of elder abuse, and it is one of the few times that domestic violence is reportable. We also look at new relationships that become violent. What we notice in these relationships is that someone may have had a very perfectly happy marriage and one of the spouses dies. And then they are preyed upon by for the lack of a better word, a gigolo. Someone who comes in and wines and dines and takes over their relationship. And these new relationships are a scam. Whether it's a sweetheart scam or any other type, these relationships often become violent. And the victim doesn't understand because they may have been in a very nice traditional marriage with no violence prior to that, and they're not sure what happens. And then if you understand the dynamic of domestic violence, of power and control, the point of getting violent is to control the person that they have the relationship with. So we see that occurring with second marriages or second relationships for a lot of older women. We see a late onset of abuse due to the medical issues. This can either be because of dementia or any other kinds of medical issues that may happen. People are not ready for those in their life, and so people can become either emotional, psychologically, or physically abusive to their partner or to other family members. Also a change of lifestyle, and one of the biggest things we see here are retirement and grandparents raising grandchildren. So some people who in their life were very controlling at work, micromanaged you at work, and I'm sure we can all remember working for a micromanager, when they retire, they go home and micromanage their partner, which often can lead to some type of abuse. We also see grandparents who are now raising grandchildren suffer from abuse in later life, either by the family member that they're taking care of the children for, or by the children themselves who are raised in these unhealthy environments where there's domestic violence, drug and alcohol issues. And these children often, very often become abusive to the grandparent who's caring for them. The youngest child I ever had who abused his grandparent was 12 years old, and he hit her in the head with a phone when she tried to tell him to stop talking to his friends late at night. So this is not uncommon, but it's not well documented nor well reported because neither grandparents or family members want to report these. Grandparents especially don't want to report because they're afraid this child will be put into the foster system, and they think that's worse than suffering from the abuse. Then again, we have abuse by the adult children or the grandchild, and these grandchildren could be as young as I said as 12 and as old as 35 or older. These are children or grandchildren or adult children who are trying to take advantage of their parent or their grandparent simply for financial gain. Often they don't work, they don't have another place to live. The grandparent feels sorry for them. They don't want them living on the street, so that it would be easier for them to suffer through the abuse than think that they have harmed one of their family members. And when we look at non-domestic elder abuse, these are things that happen outside of the home. The first place we always think of is nursing homes. We know that only about 10% of elder abuse occurs in nursing homes, and very often that is due to poor training on the behavior of the staff in the nursing homes. A small percentage, just like any other type of violence, is by strangers. That is really under 5%. And then self-neglect. And self-neglect increases with people's capacity to understand how to take care of themselves is detrimental. So we see a lot of that, again, with some type of long-term illness, dementia, Parkinson's, things like that, where they're no longer to take care of themselves, yet they're not willing to give up their independence or may not recognize that the neglecting themselves is harmful. So who does the abusing? What we know is that most of those who perpetrate financial abuse are family members. These are husbands, wives, sons, daughters, grandchildren. And some of the things that we know about these people who take advantage is that they have some type of other problems going on, mostly financial, could be drug and alcohol problems. They expect to inherit the money from their elder, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard adult children say, well, I'm going to inherit it anyway, so it's my money. And I remind people that until the day the senior dies, that money is their money. And if on the day before they die, they decide to give it to the ASPCA or the church, that's their right. Nobody can be guaranteed an inheritance. And if on the day they die, they've given it away, then you get nothing, and that's their right. Often they have poor relationships with the other people who may inherit. And these are, again, the people who are more willing to report financial abuse are the family members who think that they're going to lose their inheritance. Some of the abusers are very intimidating. These are people even uncomfortable with because they're bullies and they yell and scream a lot and they try to push their opinion. They don't have empathy. They don't understand how their behavior can affect somebody and that it's definitely harmful. They're often hostile to authority, and they definitely tend to blame everybody else for their problems. You know, they lost their job because their boss was an idiot. They weren't able to keep their car because the car insurance people didn't give them an extra day to pay their car insurance. So very often they blame other people for their problems. Caregivers can be abusers too. They can be family members who are just inexperienced at providing the care, or they can be professionals who misuse their position of trust. And one of the things we always look for when we're looking at abusers is, do they stand in a position of trust with the elder? That is the easiest way for them to take advantage of somebody, is to gain someone's trust. It's a typical old con artist kind of mentality that we forget still exists out there. So if we look down at the breakdown of who abuses people, you will see that practically 90% of people are someone they know, someone they trust, or a family member. In the unknown category, the friend category, very small amount of people, especially in the unknown. And those are the ones that we look at as financial scams. And a lot of people don't report them once they've been scammed because of two things. They don't know who to report to, nor do they want people to know that they've been taken advantage of. So as you can see, again, a lot of the people who abuse are family members, but they are also broken down pretty much 50-50, whether they're male or female. And there's a good percentage, a third of them, who are over 60 themselves. So if you look at a senior who's 90, there's a real good chance if they have children that their children are probably over 60. And we have people who are over 60 still living and caring for their parents who are in their 90s, and yet taking advantage financially of them because they hadn't well planned for their own retirement, and they're trying to live off both their Social Security and their parents' Social Security and any pension. What we did see in 2008 during the downturn is a lot of these family members convinced their parents to mortgage their homes or refinance their homes, and then they lost their homes because they were unable to make those very large payments that the family members walked away with their money. The other thing we've seen recently is an upturn in family members asking their families to get reverse mortgages. Let's face it, in California, we are house rich here and often cash poor as a senior. And so the easiest way to take advantage of a senior is try to convince them to get money out of that house. And for many of them, that is their only security, is that home. Some of the adult children or people who abuse often have their own mental illnesses that have either been undiagnosed or untreated. And for a parent to know that their son or daughter has a mental illness, again, is one of the reasons they allow them to continue to abuse them, because they see their child is sick. So a lot of these children just start off living off of their parents because they aren't able to hold a job, and then they escalate into verbal and physical abuse along with continuing the financial abuse that they're doing. And remember, parents are human, and they're just afraid to admit that they're being abused by their child, because society then tries to blame the parent and saying that they're a bad parent and they didn't raise their children well. So let's get into the real topic here now that we have a good understanding of elder abuse, and let's look at financial abuse. So in California, the law is very specific that elder abuse falls into three categories. The first being illegal or improper use of the elder's money. That means if you are not paying the bills or not buying them their medical needs or food or paying for their utilities, that's an improper use of their money. The second is taking of their real property or personal property in order to use it wrongfully or with the intent to defraud, or both. So this means when adult children come in and start taking things out of their parents' home because they feel they no longer have a need for it, their refrigerator breaks, they take mom's refrigerator. I get that that's a stretch, but it's actually happened. Or they start selling off property and not giving the money back to their parent and using it themselves. And seniors do recognize that things are being lost from their house. And very often, unfortunately, people start to look at that as they're having some type of cognitive impairment when they tell you things are disappearing. And I will tell you a brief little story that happened to us on a case in Wisconsin where a woman kept asking her husband for things that she knew she had in the home. Her grandchildren bought her a set of cute little salt and pepper shakers, or somebody made her pot holders, or she kept misplacing her keys. And her husband kept saying, no, you're crazy, you're getting demented, you really don't remember. Well, he had a heart attack and he died. And in the attic later on, they found out a box that said, do not touch. And when they opened it, all the missing items were up there. So this is a way, by using their property illegally and unlawfully taking advantage of them financially, that people also convince people that they may be suffering from some form of memory loss. So that is going on to our point number 3, which is undue influence, where you're taking advantage of somebody by getting them convinced that they have an issue, or forging their signature, or stealing their possessions again, but coercing and deceiving them to either sign documents or use their legal documents improperly, or more importantly, have them question their abilities to do things. So they need to feel, we want to have seniors feel empowered and comfortable about talking about financial issues openly, even before diagnosis, so that if they do get a diagnosis, then we can actually look at how can we help them. But like I said, even in later stages, people with dementia often want to stay involved with their money as long as possible. So start those conversations early in order to help them do that. The cost of financial elder abuse, like I said, is quite high. Right now we're looking at $36.5 billion a year. And then also we look at what that breaks down to is that about 17 million is just financial exploitation by using confusing languages or pressure tactics or getting their consent to take their money. 13 million is on scams and identity theft. And obviously we're all can be victims of identity theft, but seniors are more likely because they still carry their Social Security cards in their wallet. They are trusting and they're willing to give out information, especially because they don't understand the bank is not going to call them and ask them for their PIN number, or the bank is not going to call and ask them for their Social Security number. We often tell seniors, if someone calls you and asks this and you did not originate the call, then don't give out the information, which is good for all of us to remember. If we didn't originate the call, then we shouldn't be giving out our personal information over the phone or over the internet. About 7 million is through deceit or theft by a trusting relationship, usually a family member, but can be a paid helper, and we do get a lot of those reported by family members where a caregiver has taken advantage of somebody, gotten signed on to their checking account or put on the deed to their house. I remind people that when you put someone on your checking account, the bank doesn't know whose money's in that account. They know that you both are legally available to take money out of that bank account. So whether or not you add your son, your daughter, a caregiver to your bank account, you have given them the legal right to take your money, because the bank doesn't know who put the money in. All they know is who's taking it out, and they can't prove who belongs to what. So be very careful about adding anybody onto a bank account. The other thing for family members, we should be very careful about adding people onto houses. Besides that it changes the tax structure, it may also change the value of the house and allow people to refinance the house without the owner's consent. So we want to look at all of those things that can happen. And like I said, just in a 4-month period in Orange County, we had $30 million stolen from seniors. And a lot of that, according to Adult Protective Services, was from family members taking homes. So again, financial exploitation is self-reported at higher rates than all the other abuses. And that, again, is because a lot of people don't understand the emotional and psychological part and are very afraid to admit the physical, sexual, or neglect part. So while we think that the high rate is as high as we mentioned earlier in the billions, we really don't know what the true cost is. And as Adult Protective Services, since a lot of it's never uncovered, they really estimate that the costs are much higher than what any of our studies show. One of the things how dementia affects this cognitive processing is that is the inability to manage the finances. Cognitive decline means higher loss of higher order function abilities, which can be anything from just counting coins to managing their checkbook. So if you're going out with a family member or with a senior, let them try and manage their money when you first go out and see if they are able to do that. Because if they can't, if they have lost this higher order function ability, then they aren't going to be able to not say to somebody who goes, oh, by the way, you won the lottery, and all you have to send us is the taxes, which is how the lottery scams work, is they tell you you've won, but you have to pay your taxes up front. So the first thing to know is that, A, Americans cannot play the lottery outside the United States. It's illegal. And 2, we never ask for the taxes up front. That's not how it's done. You don't do that until you get the award. But for seniors, the first question should be, I didn't buy a ticket, but for them it's very easy to say somebody gave you a ticket, and then let them think that they won the money. So they are more vulnerable in these early stages of dementia to financial abuse because they recognize they're having some issues, but they don't see what the people are doing to take advantage of them. And that is one of the largest things that we're starting to see on the financial elder abuse realm. So the dementia also affects the cognitive processes, not just memory, but how we process. So they have a reduced capacity for the working memory, attention span, and executive skills, which means, again, they can't keep their checkbook up to date. They may not remember that they took money out of the ATM. They may not remember their PIN, and so they write their PIN on their ATM card, not thinking that someone could steal the card and their money. So it affects all three areas, not just memory, which makes them, again, more vulnerable to people taking advantage of them. So some of the warning signs, again, that we see are irregular patterns of spending, withdrawals in spite of the penalties. We see a lot of that where people are taking money out of their accounts where, say, especially early on with dementia, where people are taking money out before they hit the 59-year-old limit, or they're taking money out of CDs even though they haven't matured. And like I said, bills not getting paid and utilities getting turned off are some of the biggest things we can see. When it comes to family, again, we see missing of personal items from the home, and usually very expensive items. So if you're watching your family members and you're noticing things being missing, it's a good idea to find out whether they've given them away, or if they've let somebody in the house, or if somebody else is appropriating those personal items from them. So we also look at two different forms of financial exploitation. There's pure financial exploitation, financially independent elders who have their assets that cover their needs, own their own homes, and they are taken advantage of by scammers. These are the people who may be taken advantage of by, first, one of the recent ones that have been going on, or people coming to the door and saying they're from the gas company or the electric company and there's a problem, they need to check out their house. They usually come in pairs. One person keeps the the senior at the front door while the other walks through the house, or the other one takes the senior outside, shows them the electrical panel or the gas meters, and talks to them while the other person ransacks their house. This can happen to any financially independent elder because elders tend to be a little more trusting. The other thing is the people who are taken advantage by the grandparent scam, where someone calls and says they're their grandson or granddaughter and they're in jail, or they've been arrested and they need their funds. These are just pure financial exploitation. It has nothing to do with them not being cognitively intact. So those who are physically and financially independent can be experienced of the more pure financial exploitation. And most of these people, again, are physically independent, can care for themselves, thrive, are cognitively intact, are healthy, but they are taking advantage of a con man just like anybody else might be, regardless of age. It's just easier for them because seniors do hold more wealth than younger people do. So it's easier for them to be taken financially advantage of. The hybrid one, though, that we're looking at now are with seniors who are independent financially, but are physically dependent. They either have some kind of physical health problem or a mental health problem like dementia. They may not be driving anymore, and they may require some assistance from other people, whether it's getting them to the store or the doctor or cleaning their homes. The typical, very much more frail older senior that we would see are the ones who would be experiencing the hybrid financial exploitation. So these are people who are victimized often by a relative and are victimized over and over again as studies show us, for as many as 10 years, 123 months versus a normal victim of regular financial abuse with no neglect, about 32 months. And they suffer severe health consequences, financial loss. They are no longer socially active, and they become very isolated. And there's some kind of consequence to their victimization. Not to say that people who experience regular financial abuse are not victims of the consequences to their actions, but often can recover. People with dementia and others cannot recover from that. And therefore, it's underreported. And it's underreported because of shame, fearing of losing their independence, or being moved. Kids can quietly, unlike kids, adults can quietly disappear and nobody notices them. And a lot of times the signs of abuse are mistaken as normal aging. And people with dementia may be just too incapacitated to report. So we see the underreporting is also due to them not seeing themselves that they're being abused. They feel they've been responsible for their own abuse. It's been threatened that they may never see their grandchildren again if it's a family member who's abusing them. They may be dependent on the abuser for their care or companionship, and the person may be their caregiver. They are unaware of adult protective services, and they don't know where to report. A lot of this is magnified when we're looking at cultural and non-speaking English issues, and they're not sure where to turn for help, nor do they understand that this is not legal under the state laws. So again, one of the new areas we're looking at is that people with dementia actually have a specific cognitive function called cognitive reserve that is sustained in spite of their other very specific deficits. And this is showing us that people with this cognitive reserve can suffer from the adverse emotional experience, and that they can hold on to that information, and that they may forget what they ate for breakfast, but they can remember that they're being abused. They may not be able to verbalize it, but you can see it either in their actions or their behaviors. And so even people with dementia should be considered to be evaluated to serve as a witness to the criminal events, just as any other older adult or children or people with disabilities should be allowed that opportunity. Because the study is now showing us is that in this cognitive reserve, because it's an emotional response versus a mental response like math, like what we had for breakfast, it's easier for them to remember that. And so we're asking that not to dismiss somebody when they tell you that they have been abused or are reacting in such a way that looks like they've been abused. So that's all I have this morning. I thank you very much again for attending this webinar. And Kim, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Carol. That was a very incredible, very informed and sobering topic. Thank you for your expertise in this matter. So we are at 8:27, and so we need to stay on the line a bit longer. The webinar is over, but we do welcome you to remain online. I do have some good questions from our attendees, and so let's get right into that. And let's see, our first question is, our attendee says that they were working with a family and friends that had reported sweetheart abuse scam to the police, and they were told that the gentleman in question could spend his money however he wanted to. In other words, he could send all this money to this woman if he chose, and there was nothing they could do. So the attendee is saying that it doesn't seem like all the agencies are on board with taking action on abuse. Does the senior have to have some type of official diagnosis of dementia before agencies will take action? So
often that's the case because, again, we can make bad mistakes our in life a whole life long and not be considered abused. If the family member or the friends feel that this person is being taken advantage of, which is very often the case, and the victim doesn't recognize they're being victimized because they're using their ability to love somebody else, we do recommend that they get checked by a doctor to see if there's any dementia going on or any undue influence. What the police and all of the agencies have to hear is some of those words like undue influence, that somebody's taking advantage of them, and do they have the capacity to understand that? It is true that if somebody's cognitively intact, they can give their money wherever they want as long as they understand that they're giving it away and they're not going to be getting it back. But if somebody has early stage dementia or other physical disabilities or emotional disabilities, it's really good to get them checked by the doctor so you can give the police or adult protective services that information, because then that does make this a crime and could be illegal.
And Carol, I would ask, if they didn't get what they wanted from the police, couldn't they also just go ahead and report it to APS? Because we always recommend to come out and do some education.
Right. We always recommend reporting it to APS because they can come out and do the education, and they can work with somebody longer than the police. The police need a physical crime. They need they don't know how to assess somebody to know if they have capacity. Whereas APS does have the ability to work with the forensic center to provide capacity checkups and help people work with their family doctors or neurologists or psychiatrists to get the person checked. So I would always recommend talking with APS in addition to the police. The police are mandated reporters, and they should also report to APS, but the family has firsthand knowledge, and it's always best for APS to get the firsthand knowledge.
Great. Okay, I just, before we go on to the next question, and thank you, Carol, I want to tell our attendees that we have reached the 8:30 mark. If you logged on at 7:30, you are able to leave the webinar at this time. However, we encourage you to remain online because we do have some great questions. So our next question, Carol, is how do you deal with the seniors that you were talking about who are reported and then they tell APS they're okay and that their adult child is not abusing them? They, those that are in denial or whatever. So what can we do when we see that situation happening?
So the hardest thing for us to understand is that the easiest thing for us to do is walk away. The worst thing we can do is walk away. One of the things that decreases elder abuse is having more eyes in the home. So as frustrating it is that Brother Joe is taking mom's money or Brother Joe is abusing mom, is not walking away and letting it happen. Continue to make the reports to APS. Continue making the reports if it is a crime to the police, but also try to help them get help. There are several programs, including Safe Options for Seniors with Human Options, that provides free counseling to the victim to help them understand the situation that they're in, because most people who are in these situations don't understand they have a way out, and they need a lot of counseling. On the average, my clients needed 6 months of counseling before they would even consider a restraining order, and up to a year's worth of counseling before they would kick out a family member from their home, because they have to get their self-esteem back, they have to get their ability to make really good decisions back, because the person who's abusing them has been taking that away from them.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. The next question is sort of along similar lines. One of our attendees is just saying that working with APS is just so frustrating because they see, the reporter sees obvious abuse going on, and yet the victim says, no, there's no problem, and then APS closes the case. So this is more of the same. So what does the mandated reporter do? Keep reporting, right?
Right. And I can say when I was with Safe Options, I had cases that were open for several years, and APS had closed their case once I was brought on, but I would continue to make reports if a new incident occurred while I was treating the client. But you keep reporting, because just like in child abuse, elder abuse does build a history. And so the more people who report and gets in services to these homes, the more likely it is that something will eventually happen. But again, remember, as long as people are cognitively intact and they make bad decisions, they can make bad decisions. What we want to be careful of doing is telling people that their decisions are bad. We have to help them figure that out, and that their family members are bad, because that's a personal attack on them, and you're doing just exactly what the person who is abusing them has been doing them, is telling them what they're doing is wrong. What you're telling them is probably true, it is wrong, but they don't see it as any different than the person that's abusing them. So it's hard. And APS does do the best they can, and sometimes just having them go out multiple times will change the tide.
Good. Yeah, so let's keep that paper trail going, right, and not give up.
Right.
Many of us on the line, like myself, have been working with seniors for many years, and I have to say, Carol, that going through this lecture really recommits me to being an advocate and, using my eyes and ears and always being aware of the possibility of abuse. So we thank you for that. And we have more questions. So again, the webinar is over. You are free to leave if you want, but I encourage you to stay because these questions are really great. The attendee that asked the last question said, by the way, APS was also alerted to the man's incapacity. They were provided with the woman's name, address, and phone number, and no one took action. APS in Orange County is not very active in dealing with serious issues. I noticed another question was also about APS. So no reply needed here, but I think, Carol, I think part of this is a function of the budget, right?
Well, part of it is possibly, but also part of it is somebody's privacy. So even though it looks like APS may have done nothing, they cannot tell the reporting party what they've done because the person they're reporting on, regardless of if they have capacity or not, does have the right to privacy. And just because it looks like they're not doing anything, again, it takes a lot of visits for them to really accomplish what they need. And behind the scenes, they do a lot of work. So I would never say they don't do anything. It just sometimes, and I agree, feels that way. But we have to keep making those reports because they are very good at their job. And again, if somebody has capacity, they have to let them make bad decisions. But somebody without capacity takes a little longer because it may be getting other family members involved. It may be getting the courts involved. And those all are time processes.
That's important insight about the organization. Thank you so much, Carol. This question reads, a parent with dementia exhibits signs of abuse after being taken home from a dementia care facility. If adult children or caregiver contacts APS about concern, will APS take the elder from the family to investigate abuse? You know,
No.
I'm going to read that again because that's kind of confusing. So the parent with dementia is showing signs of abuse after being taken home from a facility. If the adult children contact APS about their concerns, will APS take the elder away from their family to investigate the abuse?
So there's a misconception that APS is similar to CPS in the fact that they can remove people from their home. So generally they can't. There's got to be usually a court order or some actual physical harm that's going to happen, like there's no electricity, there's no food in the house, things like that. But if the family member removes them from a facility and they are making the assumption that the facility abused the parent, they would report that to the ombudsman's office because if APS only covers those people who are abused in their home, whereas in a facility that's covered by the ombudsman's office, and they will do the investigation. But if the family removed them from the facility and they're home safe with the family, they're not going to remove the family member from them.
Okay. Thank you, Carol. And this is so interesting. I want to share this with you and with our listeners. Someone is saying that they're really enjoying the questions and answers, but they have to log off and make an APS report. So that's evidence that, your words have a powerful impact on our listeners. Let's see. At what point do you involve the local police instead of APS?
If it's immediate harm, if you know that the police need to come out and make an immediate arrest, or we look at danger to self, danger to others, is when we call 911. You never want to put somebody in immediate risk. APS they do have 24 hours and 10 days. So depending on the type of report, it could take 24 hours, it could take 10 days for them to come out. But if somebody's in immediate risk right now, you call the police.
Okay, great. Let's see. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. Okay, now this is confusing, but I think it actually maps back to the earlier issue. Regarding current answer, it should be reported to CCLD, not the ombudsman.
Community care licensing can be reported to also. A few years ago, the ombudsman's law statutes were changed. In the beginning, they weren't allowed to investigate issues of abuse. And I think the person writing in is correct. Since the person is no longer in the facility, you could call community care licensing and report your suspicions to them.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I think that covers all of our questions. And again, I just want to thank our speaker, Carol Tryon, Family Services Director at Alzheimer's Orange County. We're so grateful to you for your time and sharing your expertise. I also want to thank our wonderful partnership with O'Connor Mortuary, where you experience compassion and care choices. Um, our next webinar is coming up on Friday, June 1st at 7:30 a.m. and we'll be exploring the topic of clarifying the myths of hospice care. So that should be very informative as well. So again, watch for your evaluation. It should pop up on the screen as you leave the webinar, or you may receive it via email. And when you return that evaluation, you'll be receiving your certification, your continuing ed credit. I think that's all. If you want to learn more about upcoming webinars and other educational opportunities, you're welcome to visit our website, www.alzoc.org. And I will let you know that tomorrow from 9 to noon here at Alzheimer's Orange County, we'll be conducting a professional training on dementia care, again with CEUs. If you're interested in learning about that, please go to our website or give us a call. We still have openings for that. Thank you, Carol Tryon. Thank you to our partners, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.